when you are. All right, Chapter 3, Federalism. In order to make up some of the time that we've missed, because gosh knows we've missed 2 classes at this point, I wanted to go ahead and film a couple of videos to introduce Chapter 3. I wanted to introduce Chapter 3, maybe more importantly this week, I wanted to save the class time for the articles. So please watch this before Tuesday's class, certainly before Thursday's class, so we're pretty much understood as far as how things work. Federalism. Chapter 3 is basically dealing with federalism, and I want you to think about it in this regard. When you think about being somebody that lives in Rockville, for instance, you're going to be a citizen of Rockville. You're going to be a citizen of Montgomery County. You're going to be a citizen of the fine state of Maryland. You're going to be a citizen of the United States. Or in other words, even if you're not a citizen but you're living here, these 4 governments, the Rockville City, the Montgomery County, the Maryland State, and the United States federal government are all going to have power over your life at the exact same time. This is this idea of federalism. Federalism basically says that there are going to be multiple governments that are exercising influence over your life at the same time. Now, let's just start off with a question. How many governments are there in the United States? The obvious answer is going to be 1. There's 1 federal government, but there are also state governments. So I guess the next obvious answer is that there are going to be 51 governments, 1 federal and 50 state. Okay, how does this work? Well, there are also going to be local governments, county governments, township governments, and so on. So when you start doing the math on this, it begins to multiply and multiply and multiply. There's a quote that's going to be down at the bottom on page 41, and this is a definition of federalism, but it also breaks down this number of governments that are in the country. And again, I want you to think about this for a second. How many governments are there in the country? But let me give you this definition. It says here, federalism, and this is about 10 lines up from the bottom on 41. Federalism disperses authority among different levels of government, providing citizens various platforms for political participation. This chapter focuses primarily on government at the national and state levels, but the nation's governmental structure is much more complex. In addition to the federal and state governments, the United States is composed of 3,034 county governments, 19,429 municipal governments, 16,504 township governments, and 48,000 special and school district governments. In other words, if you do the math on this, the United States is going to have roughly 88,000 governments that are operating at the same time. Now, don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that you are going to be subject to all 88,000 of these governments, because what a school board does in California or what MoMI or North Carolina is doing has no relevance to what's going on in Rockville, Montgomery County, Maryland, United States. Has nothing to do with that. But what I am saying is that there are a lot of places where you, as somebody that's interested in the government, can go and voice a concern, maybe run for office, maybe try and get a problem solved. This is basically what we're talking about. Now, when you look, Federalist number 51, and let me go back and build on something that we had talked about last week. If you remember last week, we had set up this idea of separation of powers. You're going to have your legislature or your Congress. You're going to have your executive or your president. You're going to have your judiciary or your courts up here, and this is going to be at the federal level. Well, understand, when you talk about federalism, you're not just going to have a federal level, but you're going to have a state level as well. So there's going to be a state legislature, say in Annapolis, Maryland, for instance. There's going to be a governor of the fine state of Maryland. And there are also going to be courts within Maryland. Again, this is the state level. You could take this a step further, and you could actually go down, not just to federal and state, but you can go down here to the local level as well. And instead of a legislature, maybe what you're actually going to have would be something along the lines of a city council. Maybe instead of a governor or a president, what you would have would be something along the lines of a mayor. And maybe instead of courts, what you would have would be something along the lines of a magistrate. Bottom line is, think about this almost like a tic-tac-toe board. When you look at what federalism is, you're basically going to be dividing each of these levels among different branches of government. You're not only going to be dividing each of these levels amongst themselves, but you're going to be separating them from each other as well. And the beauty of this is that there's going to be a natural push and a natural pull between all of them. So when you think about it, and I'm just going to draw the arrows here for the national and the states, but when you think about it, the founders in Federalist number 51, divided the national government into three branches. And these branches will fight each other in order to keep all of them from becoming too powerful. Having said this, not only are the individual branches going to be fighting, but the individual levels of government are going to be fighting. Meaning there's going to be a natural pull and tug and pull, if you will, between the federal and the state governments. So the gist of federalism, very simply when you look at this, and let me read this off of Federalist number 51. You're going to try and preserve the liberty of the people by dividing the government amongst itself based on federal, state, and local, but between itself as well, between the different branches. This quote in the indented part on page 44 says, "In the compound Republic of America," and this is from Federalist number 51, "the power surrendered by the people is first divided between two distinct governments, and then the portion allotted to each subdivided among separate departments." Two distinct governments. In this instance, they're talking about the federal government and the state government. And then they go on, and when it says in here, subdivided among separate departments, legislative, executive, and judicial. Again, that push and pull between the levels of government, and then the push and pull that's horizontal between the branches. Hence, a double security arises to the rights of the people. The different governments will control each other at the same time that each will be controlled by itself. So basically, legislative, executive, and judicial are so busy fighting amongst themselves, they can't go too far into the state prerogatives. By the same token, the legislative, government, and courts are going to be fighting amongst each other to the point where they can't necessarily go too far into the national prerogative. So by dividing power both horizontally and vertically, what you've basically done is you're protecting liberty. Now, when you go back and you look at the beginning of the country, very simply it worked like this. Remember the Articles of Confederation. Who had the power in the beginning? Inevitably, somebody yells out, "Federal government!" Well, no, it wasn't. Because if you remember, it was unanimous. In order to get a law passed, all of the states had to be unanimously supporting it, and not all of the states always did. So if there were 13 states, 12 of them could agree, one of them could disagree, 90% plus are in agreement on this law, but that one state would have killed it. It was clear that the states held the power. And when you go back and you look at the beginning of the Constitution, there was a lot of uncertainty there, because the states still wanted to exercise their power. They still wanted to be the top dog. And in the beginning, the states were. The states were probably up here when you think about it as far as where their power was. And unfortunately for the federal government, it was much closer to down here. The states were the ones that were running the show. And if you go back and you think about it, from basically the beginning of the country until the end of the Civil War, it was the states that really ran things. They were the ones that were the primary power. Now, as soon as the federal government reined in those rebellious Confederate states at the end of the Civil War, the federal government began to be on a much more even plane. And what you'll see here is that the state government and the federal government had some give and take. Basically, what they were doing over the course of time, when you go back and you think about this, is depending upon the issue, depending upon the personalities, sometimes the states would win, sometimes the feds would win, but basically they had a rough balance. And this rough balance, if you will, carried from the beginning, or pardon me, the beginning of Reconstruction after the Civil War up until the Great Depression. When the Great Depression hit, the states, and a lot of the federal folks as well, began to realize that you needed a strong federal government to deal with the economic issues. You needed a strong federal government to be able to deal with the Great Depression. You needed a strong federal government, quite frankly, to begin to start thinking about World War II, because that wasn't necessarily that far away. Not necessarily for the United States directly fighting, but certainly for fighting to begin. With this in mind, since the beginning of the Depression, the die has been cast, so that you might say there's been a 180. The federal government is now the body that is at the top, and indeed the states have been relegated to a subservient position. Now it's the federal government who can say jump, and the states are going to be the ones that are going to answer how high. That's basically what we're looking for on this. The Supreme Court, over the course of time, has been the one that has been, I would say, the arbiter. And it's been the Supreme Court who in the beginning was trying to establish the powers of the federal government. In that center period, it tried to remain a rough equilibrium basically between the federal government and the states. And certainly it's been the Supreme Court that has stamped the federal government as the overall arbiter, if you will, the overall strong branch. And indeed, they have made this legal. With federalism, what you're seeing is that it was Reagan a number of years ago that wanted to do a devolution revolution. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next video, but even trying to to shrink the size of government, quite frankly, Reagan and others who have followed him have not done particularly well.